Last week, we looked at the first part of a kind of a two-part. Probably is going to be more than just two parts, but it was the beginning of kind of a two-part, very specifically on how to determine perhaps who should be an elder within a congregation. We first established that in the New Testament, elders really are the only, if we can use the terminology, authorized example of church leadership. We really don't know what else was going on, if there were churches who did not have elders. If there were, what did they do? How did they take care of it? All we do know is that establishing elders in congregations was a priority. From the very earliest churches that we find within the New Testament, even as early as Paul's first journey, churches that were established for just a few months, it was a priority to make sure that they had elders to lead them. As important as it is to have elders, it's just as important to make sure that the elders who are selected that are chosen to serve within that position are men who are the right for the job. The Bible clearly points out that there are certain traits that must be involved for someone to be considered what we would call qualified. As I suggested last week, we don't start the discussion in 1 Timothy or in Titus, but though you start the discussion with what is an elder, that these titles are descriptive, that a person who's going to serve as an elder, first and foremost, is a person that we would look at to shepherd or to be a pastor, someone who is an overseer that would be able to oversee or be a bishop for the church. Someone who is an elder or presbyter, that is someone who is older and wiser. There is life experience. They're down the path, and they can lead others by their wisdom. Remember in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11, elders and teachers are put together. He gave some as and some as and some as, and then he puts elders and teachers together as if they are really one and the same. The fancy word that we use for it is the word teachers is an apposition. That means it's connected to the elders, that their primary goal, responsibility, they are a gift that is given by the Spirit to churches in order to be a part of the teaching, in order to build up the body in love. So the first wave that we would look at of someone being qualified to be an elder, I believe, stems from them matching these descriptions of what an elder, a pastor, what a bishop, what they look like. First and foremost, before you turn to 1 Timothy, before you turn to Titus, is this person a leader who can be trusted to guide the church spiritually, to teach and instruct? Is he wise and able to lead? And it's crucial that we understand this before going to the list in Timothy and Titus. We don't start there. We start by first seeing, is this someone who is qualified to be a spiritual leader? Does he exhibit these qualities? Is this someone that you would go to, that you would seek advice from? Someone that if he came offering advice, would you listen to it? If he came with a reprimand, would you take that in? Is this someone who has developed a relationship by which he has a certain influential cache that's stored up, and what he says carries weight because of who and what he is? These are the questions that we ask first to determine if somebody is qualified to be an elder. Even so, as I stated last week, that does not mean that the lists in 1 Timothy and Titus are unimportant, because they are vitally important to the process determining who should lead the church. They're just not where the discussion begins. Really, it's kind of where the discussion somewhat concludes. So if we're going to talk about who should not serve as elders, which is kind of what we're looking at, is we're going to be looking at the relationship between the elders and the church to the elders and such, we need to spend a little bit of time talking about these lists. So this morning, what I want to do is spend our time looking at the traits that we find in the lists in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1, and determine their usefulness in seeing who can be qualified to be an elder. Good morning. It's good to be here this morning, isn't it? Sorry for those of you who weren't wanting to stand yet again. I do appreciate the fact that you did it anyway. Sorry for throwing you off there, Kelly. It makes a big difference, believe it or not, if you stand up right before I start talking. Because when you stand up, everything resets itself, your attention span resets itself, your energy resets itself, everything resets, and quite frankly, you need a reset right before I start talking. That is really important. So, some of you are nodding in agreement. Yes. Yeah, I've been around here long enough. You know that's the case. So, that's why I was in the back kind of waving Kelly down like, make them stand, make them stand. So, yeah, you will appreciate it by the time we're through. I will just say that, and thank you, Kelly, for being willing to go off script for me there. It is good to be here. It's good to have this opportunity to worship together, to sing these songs together, to take of this memorial proclaiming the Lord's death together. It's just really nice to be here with you, and really appreciate the opportunity that I have this morning to open up the Word of God with you. We are talking about perhaps some things that are worthy of further discussion, maybe looking at some ideas in regards of eldership that might be new ways that they're thought of, and we'll talk about a few things today as we look at the list in 1 Timothy and Titus. And I invite discussion, pushback, questions among each other. I invite every question that you might have, and just go to one of the elders, and they'll answer everything for you. That's the way it works, right? No, we will be discussing perhaps a couple things that might be just a little bit different, and maybe not. I've been surprised before with how well things have been already understood, and just in other ways that weren't at places that I'd been before. But I do appreciate the spirit that is here within this group, that really I have no hesitation to present what I believe the Word of God says. And I don't sit there and wonder, how is this going to be taken? What's going to be the effects of this? Is this going to cause problems? Because I know that the Spirit is right with the folks who are here and a part of this group. And I really appreciate that. So as we talk about these things, let's enter into our discussion. And I really want to start with a passage that was read just a few moments ago, 1 Timothy chapter 5. And through all of this, talking about receiving a rebuke against an elder, remember Timothy's at Ephesus, and we are years past. In Acts chapter 20, remember on Paul's, what we call the third journey, on his way back, he stopped and he talked to the elders of Miletus and said, hey, y'all have got problems coming. Savage wolves are going to come, not sparing the flock. And he tells them, prepare for this. And then years later, he writes the letter to the Ephesians, and he says, hey, y'all need to get yourselves together, get unified together, put on the armor of God and get ready, because the fight is coming. And then he writes to Timothy in Ephesus, I believe, in the middle of that very fight. And he says, look, do not accept a charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. In other words, don't let things devolve into just a big witch hunt among the eldership, among the leaders. Take your time, do process, do everything right in the way that it's taking place. But interesting phrase down in here, he says, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. Now, it could just be in general, laying on of hands as a process, something that they did. He may be totally switching gears at this point. I think it's tied to the elders. He could be saying, don't lay your hands on them, as in the very first thing, admitting a charge against them, and laying your hands on them disciplinarianly. Anyway, having to do with discipline. Possibly. I don't think those really catch the nuance. I really think this is talking about the ordination of elders. That at the process of the ordination of elders, the laying on of hands, that would take place to bring an elder into that position, I think what he's warning him is, don't do that hastily. Because if they cause problems with the group, that's going to be on your shoulders, Timothy, as the evangelist who implemented this person into the eldership. I think it's symbolic. The way of laying on of hands is often spoke in the way of appointing somebody. And so I think he says, there will be people worthy of discipline, but if it's one of the elders that you had put into that position, you are going to bear their guilt as well. In other words, false teachers are rising up in Ephesus, and the best place for them to work their magic would be in the leadership itself. So don't hastily appoint someone into the eldership position. Don't do it on a whim. Don't do it and doubly make sure that this is the right person. I think this warning is just as viable for us today. As I said last week, we look for men who can serve as shepherds. But once we feel that we have found those men who can serve in that capacity, there are also a couple places we can turn to make sure that we're not making a mistake by placing this individual in this position. There's a reason that Paul gave Timothy and Titus a list of traits or character traits, I guess, that an elder should possess. Again, not where we start, but I think it has to be a crucial part of what we do when we are attempting to select elders who will serve within the church. Not just anybody should be thrown into that position. There are people that if you put them in, they could do a whole lot of damage. So I think it's important to have elders that are put in who are qualified for the position. Let them guide the church, that they are qualified to God. So all of this to say, let's talk about these lists. Now, we could spend an entire quarter in a class just simply talking about these lists. How many of y'all have done that before? Been through a class? The entire class was just looking at Timothy and Titus lists for eldership. And even then, there were probably parts of the discussion that were left on the floor and you didn't have time to get to, because there's a whole lot that you can discuss. I'm going to boil this down into just a few minutes. So understand, I'm not being exhaustive here. I'm actually working with the assumption most folks here are fairly familiar with these lists and that they are kind of self-explanatory. Even if you're not very familiar with them, as you look at them, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. I understand these. The first thing, though, to notice is that the two lists in Timothy and Titus are not identical. Now, for those of you who may not know exactly what I'm referring to, I'm not going to go to these places and list them and read through them. They'll all be up here, by the way. But Paul, later in his ministry, towards the end, some of the very last letters that he sent a letter to Timothy, who was in Ephesus, and he says, hey, if anybody wants to be an elder, he gives a list of things, just bam, 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 one after another, that they either have to be or cannot be, depending on what it was, positive or negative, to say, don't let someone be an elder if they don't match up to this list. He also sent a letter to Titus. And really, the very first thing that he gets to in Titus, in chapter 1, he says, I sent you there so that you could appoint elders in all the cities. And then he gives a list, much like the list in chapter 3, 1 Timothy 3, where it's just bam, 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 just one thing after another, positive, negatives, and says, be careful who you put in. And really interesting, these lists are not identical. Even though Paul wrote these letters around the same time, to the best of our understanding, he didn't copy and paste. He's not using a source that was handed down to him that he's passing on to somebody else. He doesn't have a list that's just kept in place. This isn't the list that they used when they appointed elders in Galatia and all of those places and anywhere else that he's appointed elders, and he's pulling the list out and sending it on to them. They're not identical. And I think it's important that we begin understanding that. We'll talk more about that in a second. But here are some things that are identical or just barely word-wise in the Greek, just barely different, but pretty much the exact same thing, same wording, same everything. That a man must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, self-controlled, hospitable, not a drunkard, not violent. Those are pretty much identical in both lists. Now, there are also a grouping that I said, okay, I'm looking at the words that are here. These are pretty much saying the same thing. And so they're kind of the same thing in each list. That he's able to teach in Timothy or instruct in Titus. That he's not quarrelsome in Timothy, or he's not quick-tempered in Titus. That he's not a lover of money to Timothy or greedy for gain in Titus. That he keeps his children in submission, he tells Timothy, or in Titus, children are believers. Now, in these right here, these are either the exact same wording, or the wording is similar enough that he's basically saying the same thing to both people. However, there are some things that are in Timothy only that Titus did not have access to. That is, being sober-minded. When it talks about being sober-minded, this is an individual who thinks clearly. We would say someone who is level-headed, respectable. You're able to respect him. He's gentle. That is, he doesn't force his way. He's willing to be wronged. Sometimes he is even willing to yield if that's what the situation calls for. He manages his household well. This could have been put in with keeping children in submission, but I think it goes a little beyond just the relationship with the kids, so I set it apart as separate. He's not a new convert. You don't want to place somebody who isn't very far down the path of Christianity. He may be an older man, and he may be wiser because of age, but he also needs to kind of be seasoned in Christianity as well, or in a relationship with God. And he has to have a good reputation among those outside the church. We're going to talk more about this in a bit, but it goes back to the idea of being above reproach. It's very important how people outside the church see someone. You want to make sure that the demeanor that's here is not simply a facade. It's not just someone acting the part and you place them in leadership. Now, just as there are qualifiers that were given to Timothy, not to Titus, there are some that are given to Titus that Timothy did not have access to. Timothy never saw this part of the list. That is, that someone is not arrogant, that they love what is good. I think what that means is they look for the good in people. They try to establish the good in things. They don't focus on the negative, always trying to point out faults and problems. What they do is they find the things that are positive and build those up, and that they are there to encourage and bring out the positive aspects of people. They're upright, fair. They can see what is truly right in situations, holy. They're devoted to God. It's demonstrated in everything that the man stands for. They are disciplined. That is the idea that they have mastery over themselves, that they're able to maintain proper discipline in their lives, that they hold firm to the word. Now, this could easily have been included in able to teach, but I think it carries a nuance to it. It's not just being able to teach, but it's also living the word, having it shown through their actions in and of themselves. And then again, something that could have been included in the ability to teach is the ability to rebuke those who contradict the word. Again, I think the nuance here is good. It's not simply that he's able to instruct and teach, but he's able to determine when people are setting themselves up against the word of God, he's able to rebuke them properly from the word of God and has that ability to do so. Once again, some of these on here, Timothy had, Titus did not. Some of these Titus had, Timothy did not. And I think that there are some really important implications from understanding this fact. We need to be very careful in how dogmatic and how rigid we are with these lists. Typically speaking, the way that I have been in positions or been in places where these lists have been studied, looked at, maybe even trying to determine the appointment of elders and such, usually what this was done is we just kind of put a little checkbox beside each of these and assume that every single category is important. Every single thing up there on all three columns must be checked off so that this person can be determined that he should be leading. And we could be so incredibly nitpicky in our thought processes that nobody but Jesus himself could be qualified to be an elder. Well, he actually was never married here and didn't have children. Never mind, Jesus could not even serve as an elder in the church, according to the way that we typically would look at these, the ways of understanding these lists. We could make it to where nobody could ever possibly match up to this. Remember what Paul was trying to do. He told Timothy, go and appoint. He didn't tell Timothy, make sure nobody gets appointed. There's a big difference between those two mentalities. And the fact that Timothy and Titus were given different lists to accomplish this task, this to me is just quite amazing. I don't think it was purposeful. For the longest time, I just took the view that, well, I knew that in Crete, Timothy was going to look for these things. Titus was going to look for these things. And in Ephesus, Timothy needed these things. And actually, I've gotten to the point, I don't think that's the case. I really don't think that he's being singular for the circumstance that the individual is. I think Paul just didn't have a list. There was no standard list. There was no, who's going to be an elder? Oh, it's these things. It didn't exist. And so when it came time for Paul to write these letters, he just sat and said, well, this is what you're looking for. Someone who this. And he didn't keep it as a list. He didn't say, oh, wow, that was pretty good. I think we need to have some scribes copy this one over and over and over and over again. Let's just disseminate this out to all the churches, and let's make sure that every church uses this list. No. Not long after writing the first list, he writes a second list. And he doesn't even reference the first one. He just writes another list. And this second list is a lot like the first one, but it's not identical because there wasn't a standard set that they were using. There wasn't something that was facsimiled on a regular basis. The list itself, I don't think, existed. Which is why Paul just writes what he thinks is a really good list. There are some implications, I think, to that. The idea, I believe, if Titus used his list, he would find the very same people that Timothy would find if Timothy used his list. They would find, even if you took away the Timothy only part and Titus does this, the people that Titus finds are probably going to have these very qualities anyway, aren't they? And even if you take this out, the people that Timothy finds, if I didn't get those backwards, just, make the necessary changes, right? Whatever. The people that Timothy finds, even if he doesn't have Titus list, they're probably going to contain these characteristics anyway. The point is, he's not coming up with a codified list that says these point by point by point by point by point are the things that you have to look for. What he's doing is he's saying, look for this kind of person. Try to find kind of person. Make sure that the person that you found is the right guy, generally speaking. It's not a scientific process. These lists are not meant to produce a checklist, especially as we often use them. The fact that they were different, especially considering they were written around the same time, tells me the specifics are not nearly as important as the bigger picture. In fact, I think when you look at these lists, there is, I believe, one basic trait in each of these lists that really the rest of them are meant to describe. And that one basic trait is the man must be above reproach. That's what it all boils down to. He must be above reproach. This is the first trait that's mentioned in each list. In fact, it's mentioned twice for Titus. The point is, if you put a man in place to lead the people, you better make sure that man is not going to bring shame upon the church because of the behavior of who and what he is. If he's going to be a leader, you don't want just anyone doing the job of leadership. He has to be someone that you can't find major fault with. You don't want to stick someone in point of leadership and then have someone from the outside look at him and say, really? That guy? That's the guy that you chose who's leading you? Wow, I'd hate to be a part of your group. That's all we're really trying to do. It's determining if his character is worthy of following. Is this one quality is further defined by everything else that you see on either list. But the point is, it all goes back to this one idea. Is he above reproach? That is he someone that nobody else is going to say, that's a horrible pick. I can't believe you picked him because of X, Y, or Z. In a sense, all of these things are definitely applicable in the discussion. I mean, these are the ways, are they not, that Paul said, here's how to look for someone above reproach. Look for these things. But really, being above reproach is the most important attribute for placing somebody within leadership. Is the man above reproach? And notice as well, when figuring out if a man is indeed above reproach, everything on these lists is subjective in nature. In other words, there is not a single thing on either list that is just simply a black and white, he is or he isn't. Everything here makes you step back and say, okay, this individual, would I consider this individual to be quick-tempered? That's a subjective qualification. You have to observe the subject, look at it, and make a determination, do I or do I not feel as if this person is quick-tempered or is not quick-tempered? Is he gentle? Is he not gentle? Is he self-controlled? Is he not self-controlled? There's a lot of decision-making that comes onto the congregation because they have to decide if a man meets this or not. There is no specific absolute standard. There is no line that's set. Remember, subjective does not mean that you can make it whatever you want. Some people, I think, they hear the word subjective and they want to run for the hills because they hear it too often in the wrong types of contexts. There's nothing at all wrong with making subjective decisions. It simply means that you are determining something that is not concrete. You're determining it based on the evidence. You look at the evidence and you say, to the best of my knowledge, this is true. That's subjectivity. Remember, an objective quality would be something that is either yes or no. There's no degrees of right or wrong. There's no gray area. A term I learned from Kevin a couple of years ago, it's a go, no-go gauge. And I hope I used that term correctly there, if that's not what it was. But, it's that either it is or it isn't. It's black and white. There's no way to determine it's clearly true or it's clearly not true. I believe every single thing on this list is subjective. It requires thought. You have to say, generally speaking, is this true? Of course, when I say that everything is subjective, perhaps, maybe, this might have raised some eyebrows, particularly folks who might say, well, what about, like our Hobbit friends who were wondering if Aragorn knew about second breakfast. What about second breakfast? You might think, maybe I have somehow, perhaps unfamiliar with a couple of statements that are actually clearly objective, right? There are a couple things in there that is a go, no-go gauge. Are there not? Well, part of this discussion, I think it's important, comes to seeing and understanding Paul's illocution. Remember, we focus oftentimes on the locution. That is simply the words that are written. And we ignore, oftentimes, what did Paul actually mean by these words? What was the effect that he meant for them to have? We just simply jump to our own perlocution. That is the way that we understand the words that were given. And oftentimes, if we're not careful to make sure that we're doing our due diligence, we're going to misapply the words that are given. So let's go simply beyond the locution of these and see if we can determine exactly what Paul meant by some of the words that he wrote. There are two main ones that we're going to discuss. We're going to look at. These two are often viewed and determined to be simply black and white. There is no other way. It's one or the other. And the first of those is that he is the husband of one wife. This seems to be pretty black and white, right? Is he married or not? How many wives has he had? Just one wife? We're good. That's, to a lot of people, that's the words written on the page, the husband of one wife. The question we should be asking, what does his having a wife have to do with his ability to lead in and of itself? And this begs further questions that have to be debated. And if I did a show of hands, some of y'all would say, yes, I have sat through these very debates before. But we might ask, what if this man is on his second marriage? What if his previous wife has died and he has married again? How many wives has this man had? He's had two. Therefore, is he not now disqualified because he's had more than one wife? I've heard this argument. Maybe some of y'all have heard this argument as well before. Or this man went through a divorce and all kinds of stuff happened. If you want to use the term scriptural divorce, everything was exactly as you find in Matthew, all of that. He's remarried, he's years down the road. And you would say, but wait a second, he's on his second wife. He does not meet the locution that you find right here. Or, what if his wife dies? Is he now disqualified because he no longer is the husband of one wife? Because at this point, does he still have a wife? No. I have known elders who have stepped down from the eldership because the individual's, his spouse died, passed away, and he felt he was no longer qualified to do a job that he'd done really, really well for a number of years because of this particular stipulation and wording. And before we just need to be careful with, I think, some of the answers that we give here. I want to bring this question up because, and by the way, this is the question that should be asked for every single one of these characteristic traits that we look at that's in these lists. If we're going to do a line item study, this is the question: what does this attribute say about this man's character and his ability to lead? This is the question that must be asked. You know, a man could be a horrible husband and still be the husband of one wife. But I believe this is the qualification. Literally, the phrase is, he is a one-woman man. And generally understood, what that means is that he is someone who is faithful to his wife. It has nothing to do with the number of wives that he has. It has everything to do with how he treats that wife that he has. Does he sleep around? Is he somebody who is unfaithful in various ways? And so he takes on other women, being unfaithful to the wife of his youth? Yeah. If so, that's somebody who should not be involved within the eldership. But I also think this is subjective. Maybe it's not that he has simply cheated. Maybe he's someone who's just always flirting with women. He's always keeping his eyes open. He's always looking at the menu, even if he never plans to buy anything. These are the kind of scenarios that can disqualify. A man who's married, he only has one wife, but he would not be above reproach in the way that he treats her and treats their marriage relationship. Is he faithful to her? That is a subjective quality that needs to be addressed. When we look at the relationship of the husband and the wife together, the question becomes this: what does this tell us about his ability to lead the church? Look at the relationship that he has with his wife. Is he fully, wholly devoted to her so that he is above reproach in that relationship and nobody has anything to say against the way he treats his wife? That is a subjective qualification. It's more than just, is he married or not? You have to actually think about and determine, how is that marriage relationship? Now, the second of these is that a man has believing children. Oftentimes, the question is, are his children baptized? I mean, this is really ultimately where this comes down to. Again, should be black and white, right? Are his children baptized? Okay. Go, no go gauge, right? We're on the go. We're good. We got a green light to go. Is this to say that the man's ability to shepherd the church is dependent upon the decisions of children as they make their free will choices? This view typically is that every child that a man has must have already made the choice to follow God. And then they have to stick with that choice their entire lives, or else the man has become disqualified. What if a man has multiple children, but one or more of them just have not been baptized at the moment? You know, I recently had a conversation with someone in which he talked about a man who would be really good to serve as an elder. He has a couple teenage kids who are faithful and, hard workers in the kingdom, but they also had a child who was untimely born. She was 4 or 5 years old or something. So obviously, he can't serve as an elder because he has a child who has not been baptized. Whether or not he has already faithfully demonstrated with the children that are in the point where they've been able to make that decision, he's already faithfully demonstrated his ability to lead them. What happens if a man raises children? They are faithful until they leave the presence and the influence of their father. They go out among the influences of others who lead them away from God. Does the fact that a child chooses to walk away from God in adulthood reflect on how the father led the child while he had influence on him? Again, this is our question. What does this attribute say about the man's character and ability to lead? And once again, I think the typical wording, believing children, is a little misleading. Literally, it's that the children are faithful. The word belief, faith, those are the same word, and so it's the exact same phrase. Children who believe, children are faithful, believing children, the exact same phrase. And I think most assume it's referring to children being faithful to God. And there's good reason for that. But I would suggest that's not the best option, because we don't have an object here, do we? We're not told to whom they are faithful. It just says faithful children. I think the really determining factor is you look at the children, do they act faithfully towards their father? Because again, the question is, what does the attribute say about this man's character and ability to lead? If the children are faithful to their father, the man under consideration for eldership, what does that tell us about this man? I know a man who served as an elder, really solid elder. He had two brothers. One of them was an elder in another church in a different state, and another one was a gospel preacher. These are three men who, couple elders, a gospel preacher. Obviously, their father did something right raising them, right? Except that he was a Christian Scientist and had absolutely nothing at all to do with bringing them up in Christianity. That determining factor of how the children turned out really had very little to do with whether or not he would be an appropriate person to lead the congregation. He was never put up for eldership, by the way. We never, because of that, asked the individual to start joining with us and become an elder because of that. Sometimes somebody can become right with God in spite of what it is that they do or do not receive from their father. This isn't the end-all be-all determining factor to tell us how is it that this person leads. Here's the question to ask. What kind of relationship does the father have with his children? Look at the microcosm of the family and say, after these children have spent time with this father as a leader, do they treat him like an elder? Do they come to him and seek advice when they're looking for guidance? Do they seek out his wisdom, or do his children reject him and his leadership because of the lousy job that they did? Even if those children remain faithful to God, they may remain faithful to God in spite of their father, and they actually reject his leadership. They don't come to him advice because he had a horrible relationship with him to begin with. Their relationship with God is due to other influences, not his. This is the deciding factor on whether or not children, I believe, are faithful. That is, are they faithful to the leadership of their father? For some, this might include having been faithful to the leadership in spiritual things and led to the decision to be baptized, of course. But being baptized, remember, is a personal choice. Nobody should be baptized because the father says, go be baptized. But you can tell if a child is rebellious to his father's authority simply by observing them. And this, I believe, is subjective. There was a man one time when we were selecting elders I thought was a shoo-in to be an elder. Just absolutely. Like it was a given. And our process that we did, we had forms that were filled out from the congregation, turned in with names on them and everything. And he fell short of the percentage number that we were looking for to move on to the next spot. And I thought, that's crazy. And then I looked at his wife's paper and his children's paper. And whereas one of his children was like, yeah, there was another that said, no, I don't think he should be an elder. And his wife said, no, I don't think he should be an elder. And what that tells me is that it's more than just having believing children. It's more than just being the husband of one wife. Whether or not he should sit within the leadership, sit at the gates of the church itself and lead. We can see it in the microcosm of the family. Have they demonstrated through the relationship with the wife, the relationship with the children, that he should serve in that capacity? Again, these are, I believe, all subjective. And we need to be careful. We can be so rigid with these that nobody could ever be an elder. We said that earlier, not even Jesus, right? But remember what Paul was doing with these lists, trying to find men who could serve as elders. Or making sure, not making sure that nobody ever could. The focus is not so much on whether has anybody ever done something. Instead, the question is this: typically speaking, is this person characterized by this? We don't ask the question, has this person ever lost his temper? Well, yeah, he did one time. I saw it in the foyer. Well, let's scratch him off. No, it's, does this person have an overall tendency to lose his temper? And you might say, well, I've seen him do it a couple times, but quite frankly, those were the exceptions. Most of the time, he's characterized by peacefulness. So no, I wouldn't consider him to be quick-tempered. It's how they typically are. It's a character trait, not one-time instances. And I hope we see the difference. The purpose is to find the men who do qualify. We don't want to be so tolerant that we put in men who are going to mess things up, but we also need to be careful on the other end that we don't disqualify men who should actually be serving in that capacity. Let's pray together. Our great and amazing God, we thank you for your guidance in establishing the church as the group of your people and providing the proper means for leadership. We thank you for the elders we have here, and we pray for your wisdom and guidance to be on them as you help them to lead us. Help us as well to recognize in each other the ways in which we can lead now and the ways in which we can grow into leadership in the future. We thank you foremost for the greatest shepherd who has shown us what it means to lead. We thank you for Jesus, who led through sacrifice and provided us the means by which we are saved. And it is through Jesus we now pray.